Chapter 7, Key Issue 2, is about why ethnicities have distinctive distributions, and we'll be focusing on the United States, and we'll talk a little bit about South Africa. So, within the United States, we have international migration of different ethnicities, and so where people moved to initially in the United States when they migrated into our country can determine where some of the modern day distribution still occurs of different ethnic groups. So, for example, most African Americans are descended from Africans who came here through forced migration, right? They came here as slaves during the 18th century or the 1700s. So today you can still trace, not all of, but many, we have more African Americans distributed in the southeast of the United States. And that's where the majority of African Americans were forced here into our country through slavery. And so you can still see the traces of that in the modern day distributions. And if you remember back in chapter 3 when we talked about like the Great Migration and people moving from the south, working in agricultural areas, to moving to up north to work in factories and cities in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you can still see those patterns of distribution as well. So for example, like Gary, Indiana, that northwest part of Indiana that had a large distribution pattern of African Americans, that pattern is still there because of that Great Migration, that interregional internal migration from the late 19th and early 20th century. You can also see this pattern with where Asian Americans and Hispanics are distributed. So most Asian Americans and most Hispanics in our country are descended from voluntary immigrants into the United States during the late 20th and early 21st century. And because most Asian Americans were moving to places like California on the West Coast, you still see larger distributions of Asian Americans there. You see the largest distribution of Hispanic Americans in the southwestern part of the United States. And that's because that's where most people from South and Central America would have moved to during, when they immigrated into our country because it was close. So when we talk about forced migration from Africa, we know that European countries, they acquired slaves from various regions of Africa and then sent them to the Americas. So the Portuguese would ship slaves from their colonies in Angola and Mozambique to the colony in Brazil. Other European countries would have taken slaves from the coastal strip of West Africa between Liberia and the Congo. And they would have sent them from there to the Caribbean islands and to Central and South America. And so you can still trace that pattern today. And so if you see here, this area here, this part of Western Africa is where the slave trade was concentrated. Sometimes people would have just, captured and sold the people from themselves. And sometimes rival villages and rival tribes would have, kidnapped people and sold them into the slave trade. And you can see where they were forced to migrate. And so you're going to see a large population of people from Brazil that are descended from African Americans in forced migration. Same thing with the Caribbean islands. A little bit here in Central America, and then here in the United States along the eastern coast, and then here in Florida as well. And so you can still see that passage and their descendants in these different countries. Also the slave trade, which was made illegal way earlier in Europe than it was in the United States. You can see African descendants of these slaves in England, in France, in Spain. Here is the trade route, right? Like the triangle trade route. You probably learned about this in history. So slaves were exported from Africa. Molasses would have come from the Caribbean islands. Then we would have exported rum back to Europe and England. Molasses would have also been exported back into England. And then you would have had cloth and trinkets from the UK traded right here back into Western Africa. Within the United States, you have voluntary migration from Latin America and Asia. Immigration from Mexico and Puerto Rico fueled the rapid growth of Hispanics in the United States beginning in the 1970s. The third largest groups of Hispanics came to the United States from Cuba, where they have right now the protected status, and because they're political refugees. And then Asia, the ranking of countries that we have migrants from in Asia would be China, India, the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. So you should be familiar with these patterns, that most Hispanic Americans would have come from Mexico. They might have come from Puerto Rico, which is a United States territory. And then Cuba would have been the third largest group. And then as far as our Asian Americans, they would have been they either are from these countries or are descendants of people from these countries: China, India, the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. If you look at Asian Americans by country of origin in a graph, you see that same trend. Within the United States, you see also some internal migration patterns. So African Americans have displayed two distinct internal migration patterns in the United States. We have the interregional migration from the U.S. South to the northern cities, like I just kind of talked about, during the first half of the 20th century. So that great migration when they were leaving farms in the South and going up north to work in cities. And that's where you get African American populations in places like Gary, Indiana, Chicago, New York, Detroit, Michigan. And then you had intra-regional, so within the region, from inner city ghettos to outer city and inner city suburban areas during the second half of the 20th century. So like after 1950, so from 1950 until essentially 1999, you had African Americans moving out of the city into suburban areas. So the interregional migration, again, going from the South to the North of the United States. Some more background on that. Most African Americans would have remained in the rural South during the late 19th century, and they worked as sharecroppers. So they were working fields that were rented from a landowner, and they paid rent by turning over a share of the crops to him or her. Sharecroppers don't make a lot of money, and in some cases it was barely a step up from slavery. It was impossible maybe to kind of get out of your deal, because you wouldn't have had anywhere to go, and you would have turned over a majority of your crops to the landowner, so you would have had enough to feed yourself, but usually not enough to sell and make a profit. So it was not ideal, right? It was a pretty crappy system. And that combined with the mechanization of agriculture, that served as a push factor. So landowners didn't need as many sharecroppers anymore, and so they were renting out pieces of land less often. And because you weren't able to sell much of your food, right, because you had to turn most of it over for rent and then keep the rest for yourself to eat, you didn't have the ability to really do much about it. So as you were losing jobs to the mechanization of agriculture, African Americans started to move up north. That was a pull factor, these new manufacturing jobs in the north. And they started to travel by bus and car among the two-lane roads in the United States. So you can kind of trace that. So as we entered the 20th century and cars and buses became more common, there were advertisements put out at bus stations because we need workers up north so badly. And so you can follow that pattern right here from the south to Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, New York, Boston, and then another group moving to Los Angeles and San Francisco. And you can still see large clusters of African American populations in these areas today. And they are the descendants of people who moved from the south up to north to work in general. The intra-regional migration meant that African Americans were living in these northern cities, and they tended to cluster in neighborhoods where existing African Americans were already living. These areas came to be known as ghettos, although we know the first group that ever lived in a ghetto, it was a term for places they forced Jewish people to live in Europe prior to World War II. So as African Americans started to cluster in these city neighborhoods, they call these areas ghettos, and maybe, and many of these had like tenement homes that were built, like cheap apartment buildings that were meant to house many, many people to work there. And so this public housing was built to house the workers that were coming up there, and it wasn't like an investment priority. And so they were often large buildings, poorly maintained, and tightly packed together. Over time, as more African Americans moved into these northern cities to work in the factory manufacturing jobs, the ghetto started to grow outward, usually along major avenues that came from the center of the city. At this point, that's when something called the white flight happened. We talked about that a little bit earlier this year as well. That's when people began to leave the neighborhoods because, they were afraid because they were, deeply racist. So like Detroit's white population dropped by 1.5 million from 1950 to the year 2000. So as more African Americans began to move into their neighborhoods, white people moved out. And this was made simpler by cheaper vehicles. People had more and more cars and more highways. The freeway system was established in the 1950s that made it easier for people to drive across the country. And so as we started to have a larger automobile industry, as we started to have more roads and more cities, more roads in and out of the cities, people began to move out of the cities more and more often. So if you look at Baltimore City in 1940, you can see small clusters of African Americans, but the majority of Baltimore City was below 10% African American. And if you look at Baltimore City in 1970, the clusters of African Americans have grown, and the percent of people who were of neighborhoods that were less than 10% African American was decreasing. By the year 2000, there were small pockets of areas that have less than 10% African Americans, but the majority of Baltimore today is African American. So as people started to move out from these tiny little, apartments that were set up for them to work, as they started to radiate out, white people with more money left. And same thing here. If you look at the distribution of African Americans as opposed to white people in millions, you can see that it started to drop after about 1950. Now, part of this pattern had to do with segregation. And so we had segregation by ethnicity and by race. And so the United States Supreme Court upheld a Louisiana law initially that it required black and whites to ride in separate cars. So that was called Plessy versus Ferguson. It said the law was constitutional because it provided separate but equal treatments of black and whites. After that, the Supreme Court upheld that ruling. The southern states enacted a set of laws referred to as the Jim Crow laws, and these laws were established to segregate blacks from whites. So you had to sit in the back of the bus. You had different shops. You had different restaurants. You could choose to only serve white people. The pictures of the water fountains. My mother remembers seeing the first one when she was traveling from Arkansas to Indiana, and she didn't understand what was happening because it wasn't really common in Arkansas. And that was eventually overturned. Separate was in fact not equal. And so today you shouldn't be able to segregate people. And the desegregation of our schools in the United States was a very controversial time. There were armed guards, and that led to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which we'll talk about in class. In South Africa, they had similar but stricter laws called the apartheid. So white descendants from Holland enacted a legal system that was intended to segregate its people. It was called the apartheid. It's a physical separation of different races into distinct geographic areas. So when you were born, you were classified as being either black, white, colored, or Asian. And each of these races gave you a different legal status and rights regarding where you could live, where you could go to school, where you could work, where you could shop, and whether or not you could own land. The apartheid laws were repealed in 1991, but South Africa clearly still has a deep history of racial segregation and racism. My friend was there at the Peace Corps recently, and she'd never seen such open racism. And here you can see the area for non-whites to go and the area for whites. And we'll talk about the apartheid a bit more in class too, but make sure you read through it in your book that gives you more details than I'm going over in this slide.